Morning, kids. There are no secrets anymore. In a really weird way, the Tories have started being honest about who they are and what they've done. I mean, what is there left to expose about the Tories? You don't even have to take my word for anything anymore because the Tories have admitted everything you'd ever want them to admit themselves. Want them to admit that their party is responsible for the disastrous state of the country in recent years? They did that all summer.
Rishi's policies are making us less competitive. Some of our hospitals are falling apart. When families are struggling to pay for their food, that we have put up taxes on ordinary people.
Want them to admit that their mini-budget crashed the economy? The Chancellor who announced the mini-budget did that himself.
I know the plan put forward only 10 days ago has caused a little turbulence. I get it.
Want them to admit that their Brexit is damaging UK businesses? The Chancellor did that last week.
I accept there is a transition for businesses because we voted as a country to change our trading relationship. That transition obviously presents difficulties for some businesses.
Want them to admit that rejoining the EU single market would deliver the economic growth that would help pull people out of poverty? He did that 2 weeks ago.
I think having unfettered trade with our neighbours and countries all over the world is very beneficial to growth.
Would membership of the single market be something that would boost growth and change our current economic outlook?
I don't think it's the right way to boost growth.
Want them to admit that their failure to provide safe routes for people to claim asylum in the UK is the reason why asylum seekers are having to cross the channel in small boats and risk dying in the process, meaning that their Rwanda deterrent is simply punishing the most vulnerable people on the planet for their own failures. The Home Secretary just did that.
I'm not Syrian, I'm not Afghan, I'm not Ukrainian, not any of those specific schemes. The Dub scheme is historic. What scheme's open to me?
Well, if you are able to get to the UK, you are able to put in an application for asylum.
But I would only enter the UK illegally then, wouldn't I?
Well, that would, if you put in your application for asylum upon arrival, that would be the process that you enter.
Want them to admit that despite coming to power on a manifesto saying they'd get Brexit done, it's actually going to take years? Well, I got Tory MP Ben Bradley to admit that.
Is this really something that's worked out for working class people?
Brexit's a process, right? It's not just something where you click a switch and everything's different. Got to work through these problems.
Want them to admit that they've been trying to control the news to make it more conservative? Well, Tory MP Steve Baker already did that.
Reports this morning that Paul Dacre, the former editor of the Daily Mail, a critic of the BBC, is Boris Johnson's top choice for the job of Ofcom chairman. Is that an appointment you'd welcome?
I look forward to them perhaps being appointed and being a bit more conservative and pragmatic in what is reported.
Want to hear them admit that they didn't let 16-year-olds vote at the last election because it would have helped Labour and prevented Brexit? Well, Tobias Ellwood did that.
Whilst the age of voting should be a debate that we have in this country, to suddenly thrust upon us right now, when we know it'll probably favour one particular party, now's not the right time to do it.
Want to hear them admit that they made Boris Johnson Prime Minister, knowing that he cared more about spreading propaganda than actually helping people? Well, Robert Buckland did that.
He is such a great campaigner that sometimes I think that takes first place to governing.
Want to hear them admit that they don't like journalists asking questions about the effects of Brexit, even though it's the title of their manifesto? Well, Jeremy Hunt just did that.
But I'd just like to make a point, Beth. We've got a 20-minute interview, and you've chosen to spend a huge amount of time talking about Brexit.
Want to hear the Prime Minister admit that Brexit is damaging our trade?
Why have we got the significant reduction in trade intensity that stayed low, whereas others have come back?
Yeah, as I said, without a doubt, we're changing our trading relationship with the EU, and that means a different set of controls and things that people will have to do, and that will obviously have an impact, and that I'm sure is a big part of the reason why this is happening.
Want them to admit that the Brexit checks they delayed until next year will cost UK businesses £1 billion, raise the price of food, and lead to food shortages in what they've called an act of self-harm?
You're admitting that this could save £1 billion, which means that checks would have cost £1 billion. I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm. That if you look at small deliveries of things like cheese, you were talking about 71% increase maximum level on the retail price. And frankly, at that level, goods just wouldn't have come in.
Want them to admit that deciding who gets to lead the Tory party essentially goes to the highest bidder among Tory donors? Here's Nadine Dorries.
The Conservative Party donors have said themselves that they aren't going to support the party if the Prime Minister is removed. I think a number of MPs in marginal seats need to hear that and need to understand what they're doing. £18 million those donors have donated to the Conservative Party over recent times. It's those donors that have helped us to win the election, and they need to hear that message.
Want to hear the leader of the Brexit campaign admit that Brexit has crippled over 200 businesses in Northern Ireland and could cause Jewish people to flee?
Vital drugs have not been able to be moved from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. 200 companies have stopped shipping stuff because of the problem with the food sector. It was becoming difficult for them to have timely access or any access to kosher food, and they're talking now about an exodus from Northern Ireland by the Jewish community.
Want them to admit that they deliberately take money away from people who are in poverty and give it to rich areas, while our current Prime Minister admitted that this summer.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
Want them to admit that they're breaking international law over Brexit? Brandon Lewis.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
Want them to admit that they got people to vote for Brexit by blaming all of our problems on Europe and that they actually think that poor people are just lazy? Well, here's our previous Prime Minister.
For it. In the referendum, it's like we say it's all Europe that's causing us all these problems. It's migrants that are causing these problems. And actually, what needs to happen is, a bit more. More graft.
Want them to admit that at the start of the pandemic, they locked down too late because the same government that had supported Brexit believed people cared more about freedom than staying alive, and that they were wrong to believe that? I give you Steve Barclay and Boris Johnson.
Our country is a freedom-loving country, Mr. Speaker, and it is very difficult to ask the British population uniformly to obey guidelines in the way that it is necessary.
20,000 lives needlessly lost because you didn't lock down a week earlier, and you don't want to apologise.
The concern was if we'd locked down too soon, there wouldn't be a willingness to lock down for a long period of time. Now, we actually know now that actually there was a willingness of the British public to lock down for far longer.
Or how about admitting that after the 2016 Cygnus report showed that the NHS wasn't ready for a pandemic, they failed to fix that during the Brexit years? Nadine Dorries to the rescue again. Want them to admit that Brexit is undermining the Good Friday Agreement that brought relative peace to Northern Ireland after 3,600 people were killed? Boris Johnson did that.
The Northern Irish Protocol, which I believe is undermining the balance of the Good Friday Agreement.
Want them to admit that the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, formerly known as the Policing Bill, will lead to further discrimination against black people? The Home Office already did that. So all the stuff that we say about the Tories, like they're out to help rich people at the expense of poor people, that they support racism, that they're controlled by their party donors, they lied about Brexit, that Brexit is damaging the economy, that they're fascist in the sense of deliberately trying to censor opposing viewpoints, they're already saying it about themselves loudly and proudly. But what does all that mean? Because the narrative of the Tories before the election was that they're the people's party, focusing on the people's priority, levelling up the poor parts of the country and defending free speech. And they denied any suggestion they damaged the peace process in Northern Ireland or hurt ethnic minorities. And now they're admitting to deliberately making people poorer during a poverty crisis, knowingly destabilizing Northern Ireland, intentionally attacking black people, and that they have ways of fixing their Brexit so it doesn't increase poverty during what their experts are calling the worst fall in living standards since records began, but they're choosing to keep making things worse for people. So if you're working class or from a poor area, or if you're an ethnic minority, or you're from Northern Ireland, and you're still saying that the Tories are on your side, you need to take that up with them, because they're telling you that they're not. They're telling you that they are out to hurt you. And that's not me saying it. You just heard them. And the irony is that they spent the years before the election calling their opponents traitors, that we weren't patriotic enough. And that worked well because we were the ones saying that the UK couldn't take on the EU and win. So they constantly accused us of talking the country down, while their newspapers called us the enemies of the people. But since the election, we can all see that the Tories are deliberately hurting the people. And you just heard them overtly admitting it. So yeah, language like that, it's really inflammatory and we shouldn't use it. And I don't want to say that it applies perfectly to the Tories, but have a great week.